I mean, Lincoln is a very complicated figure, right? So Lincoln is elected in 1860. He's a nominee of this new party. This is only the 1860 election is only the second election that the Republican Party actually runs a candidate in. In the first election of 1856, do you know who the Republican Party's first presidential election? Do you know who they nominated? Fremont. John C. Fremont. It's actually Fremont. There's an accent over the E. Fremont. Who was nominated in 1856. He loses. In 1860, the Republicans decide to nominate Lincoln, who is a relatively unknown person, and he's what's called a moderate. He's not an abolitionist. He believes in containing slavery where it exists, preventing it from spreading, but he's not one of these people that wants to just end slavery, and he does not support extending citizenship to black people. He doesn't necessarily view them as equal. There's a lot of stuff that he says that we would consider to be racist, right? Even into his presidency, if you look at the textbook, up until 1862, he is still pushing, sort of suggesting the idea that emancipated slaves be relocated, be recolonized to Africa, right? For people to be free and then go back. So, and not necessarily because he doesn't think he could coexist with them, like he can't accept them as citizens, but he knows, and part of it is he knows the level of racism and animosity that exists against them. So it's sort of a misguided thing. Anyways, but Lincoln is elected basically. The Democratic Party is split over the issue of slavery, a Northern Democrat and a Southern Democrat, and then there's a fourth candidate. So there are four candidates, right? And the Democratic Party is split North and South. So Lincoln ends up getting elected with only 40% of the vote. He doesn't get a majority of the vote. But because he gets the most votes and he gets enough electoral votes, he's not even on the ballot. He's not, because the Republican Party is seen as the party of abolition, of ending slavery, he's not even on the ballot in at least 10 southern states. But he's still, but the population of the North is about 23 million people in 1860. The population of the South is 12 million. But of that 12 million, 4 million are slaves. So you really only have like 8 million white Southerners, and then there's 23 million Northerners, right? So there's fewer of them, and that's going to play a major factor in the Civil War, right? There's less people, there's less industry. They can't manufacture as many weapons, and there's less railroads to move troops and supplies around. There's fewer telegraph lines to communicate with each other, so they're going to have a severe disadvantage in that war. Even though they have some generals that do actually militarily really well for a couple of years. So yeah, so Lincoln is elected. Lincoln is elected in November of 1860. A month later, South Carolina secedes. Before Lincoln is even inaugurated as president, right, which happens in March. Yeah, the inauguration used to be in March. It's now in January. So March 4th used to be the day of presidency. So he's elected in November, and then 5 months later he's inaugurated. But before that, in that 5-month period, 7 southern states have separated, and they formed the Confederate States of America, and they've nominated Jefferson Davis, who's a senator from Mississippi, as their president, who actually becomes president of the Confederacy before Lincoln is even sworn in as president, right? This is before, and this is a moderate candidate, right? He's not an abolitionist. He has not promised to end slavery, or to be an enemy of the slave states. This is very much and they did that deliberately. They nominated a moderate because they didn't want to seem they wanted to try to get as many votes as possible, and they wanted to seem, they didn't want to just be this party that only appealed to abolitionists. They wanted to appeal to a larger amount of people. And yet, even with this moderate candidate, 7 southern states decide to secede because they see the country moving in a direction as far as slavery eventually ending, and they don't want that, right? And the first state to secede is South Carolina. And one of the reasons, arguably, is that South Carolina has a slave majority. 60% of the population are slaves. So the white South Carolina population basically sees a world where the 60% of the population that are slaves, the majority, are eventually going to control the state because they're going to be given their freedom. And this is going to happen after several hundred years where we've been enslaving them and treating them really horribly. So what's going to happen when they're the majority? There's that's unacceptable to them. So yeah, so remember the Republican platform. Homesteads, protective tariffs, right? Because they're mostly Northerners, so to protect manufacturing, protective tariffs. They wanted to build the idea of a transcontinental railroad, which they end up building. One of the interesting things about the Lincoln's administration is that half of the country, or like 11 states, are going to not be represented in Congress. And most of them are from the opposing political party. So the Republicans are basically able to push through. Lincoln establishes the first national park, Yosemite. The Transcontinental Railroad, which is approved in 1862, and it's completed in 1869. Homestead Act, the opening up land for settlers. And also the Morrill Act, taking land and land grants and giving it to public universities, right? Public universities, public education. But expanding public education beyond K through 12, like primary, to include colleges and universities. So when you see like Texas A&M, what's A&M stand for? Do you guys know? Agricultural and mechanical, or you see those schools like that, like state universities or A&M University, agricultural, mechanical, or agricultural technical universities. Texas A&M is one. I think Florida has one. Those kinds of schools are what are established under the Homestead Act, or even state universities like CSUs, stuff like that. Sort of, not all of them obviously, but that sort of making it more accessible. Because up to this, in 1860, the universities that existed in this country, there weren't a lot, right? There were a lot of mostly private, exclusive. Like Jefferson had gone to William and Mary in Virginia, and Adams had gone to Harvard. There weren't as many universities. So this is really opening up, creating a sort of public university system. It is the deadliest war in American history as far as the number of soldiers who died, and civilians. Approximately 620,000 soldiers die in this war, which today would be the equivalent of 6 million. The low estimate, 50,000 Southern civilians, mostly Southern. I'm sure there were some Northern civilians that were killed by cannon fire, shrapnel, something like that. They were too close to a battlefield, or the Confederacy invades the North twice. One of the armies in the Confederacy actually invades Pennsylvania, Maryland. That's when Gettysburg is in Gettysburg. You know the Battle of Gettysburg? Some of you are familiar? That's in Pennsylvania, which is a northern state. So there's actually an invasion of the North twice. But most of this war is in the South, right? And the South is going to be occupied. Southern cities like Atlanta are going to be leveled to the ground. I mean, there's really 50,000 is the low number. Southerners die from this war. A lot of it from starvation, right? A lot of it's from starvation. Some numbers are 70 to 100,000, right? So you have a lot of wealthy slave owners who have plantations that have cotton, and there's all the food. If you look at where the agriculture in this country, especially back then, a lot of the wheat and corn and food was being grown in northern states like Iowa, Illinois, and in the South, you had a lot of cotton being grown, a lot of plantations, people that did not start growing food necessarily for the national war effort. And a lot of these, and also a lot of the people serving in the military were not slave owners. They were small farmers. They were poor white Southerners. And so you have a family, a husband, a wife, some kids on a small farm trying to scrape together some sort of existence, and the husband has to go fight in a war. That leaves mom with the kids to try to scrape together a living, some sort of, grow some food, do something. And they became a very desperate situation a lot of times. And that's one of the reasons the war was not able to continue, because people on the southern side kept deserting. There were so many desertions. They were leaving the army because they were getting letters from home saying, you need to come home. We're not going to survive another year, another winter, You can imagine being a wife whose husband goes off to fight a war, and you're left, and you may have kids to help you, but what if those kids are 3 and 5 and 7? How are you going to farm land in that situation, or how are you going to do that sort of work? And it's got to be very trying on people, And also the 620,000 soldiers who died. It's important to remember that 1 in 6 of these was from combat. I should have mentioned that before. 1 in 6 is from combat. 1 in 3, twice as many of these soldiers died from disease. Up until the last century, really, even into World War I, but really up until the last century, World War I, World War II, in wars in the 1800s and before that, most of the casualties were from disease. Right? You have huge armies that have people from cities who are now mixing with people from rural areas, and people from rural area, you know, there's different, it's similar to how there's, like, if you look at the Spanish interaction with indigenous people here in the 16th century. There are a lot of germs and stuff that are going around that some people aren't immune to or haven't been exposed to. And there's a lot of illness. You have prisons in POW camps in the South, like one like Andersonville. I hope I don't have an image here. I won't show you the images of some of the Union soldiers that were POWs in this camp, because it's like they were basically starving. People were dying. I mean, they were dying of illness. There was a lot of sanitation issues. The general or the officer, Confederate officer that ran this prison called Andersonville, he's one of the few Confederate generals or officers that's actually hanged at the end of this war. He's actually executed because the prison was so bad. I mean, if you want to look, I won't show you the pictures of some of the people that came out of this prison, because they weigh, like, we were talking about grown men who weigh like 87 pounds. The first who's heard of Geneva? The Geneva Conventions, the issue of the treatment of prisoners, the treatment of injured people, the treatment of civilians. Geneva's a place in Switzerland where there have been several conventions. There were several meetings over the late 1800s and into the 20th century, up to the end of World War II, that related to if there's conflict between nations, how prisoners should be treated, you know, and how civilians should be treated, how injured people should be treated, right? This idea of like basic levels of treatment that all nations agree on, even if they're in a war with each other, to sort of recognize a certain basic human rights and certain level of treatment, right? The first one, they're called the Geneva Conventions or Geneva Conferences. The first one was held in 1864. And it was attended by a woman named Clara Barton. She's the woman who establishes the Red Cross. This is actually a war that's going to wars are kind of interesting because they can cause a lot of displacement and a lot of death, and they're very traumatizing for people and for countries. They can also create a lot of opportunity for certain folks like women who move into the field. The idea of women as nurses and women as teachers, like we think of like an elementary school now, and most of the faculty there are women. This is the war that really creates that situation in America, where you have so many people fighting that there's so much injury and death that there's just a demand for nurses and for medical assistants, and women really fill that vacuum to the point where they actually one of them establishes the Red Cross out of it. And also teachers. Women weren't, the idea of teachers, a lot of men were teachers before the Civil War, but then when they're in the Union and Confederate Army now, right, there's a need for people to fill that void and teach, so women fill that void. The idea of serving in the military being used as some sort of a case for citizenship for former slaves, right? When eventually there are going to be soldiers, black soldiers, runaway slaves who are going to become soldiers, and using that as an argument for their own equality and like their own right to citizenship, right? Which it's kind of on the one, sad that sometimes people have to like serve, fight a war and die to be seen as equal to everybody else. It's weird, but that's just something that it's something that former slaves did. If you think about today, you see stories about dreamers, the undocumented immigrants or immigrants who want a path to citizenship through military service, right? Like this idea of being allowed to be a citizen and using as an argument for that your service in the military. When the previous president, Barack Obama, first publicly came out in support of marriage equality, of gay marriage, right? One of the first things he said to support that argument was, well, they serve in our military, right? They're soldiers. So this idea of serving in the military as being this ultimate sacrifice, and so for people who might be from a particular demographic that's not treated equally, using their service